The Dutch United East India Company's brand new return ship, the Batavia, wrecked on a coral reef off the coast of Australia. Hundreds of passengers and crew were left stranded on the Abrolhos Islands. The ship's upper merchant, Francisco Pelsaert, and the captain, Adriaan Jacobson, managed to reach Java in a longboat with 46 other survivors. At Batavia, the VOC headquarters, the man in charge of the company in the east was Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Koen. He sent Pelsaert back to the wreck on the Abrolhos Islands on the yacht the Saardam to retrieve company goods and save the people. But no one really knew where the Abrolhos Islands were exactly. On the islands, the survivors had come under attack from a group of mutineers led by the undermerchant Hieronymus Corneliszoon, a former apothecary and a man with disturbing heretical beliefs. He planned to seize the rescue ship once it arrived and use it to go pirating with his gang of mutineers. He started ordering the death of the useless survivors so they couldn't warn the rescue ship of their plans. A few beautiful women were spared and forced to sleep with the men. One group of survivors were still alive. They were soldiers led by 42-year-old Wiebe Hayes. Several survivors from Batavia's graveyard managed to escape to Hayes Island, and they warned the soldiers of what the undermerchant was doing. Surgeon Aris Janszoon had been marked for death, but he managed to escape the main island, called by the survivors Batavia's graveyard, by stealing one of the mutineers' boats. Undermerchant Hieronymus was unhappy to discover that the soldiers on the high island had a boat now. He wasn't so much worried they were going to attack, because the mutineers had all the guns and could blow Team Hayes out of the water the moment they showed up at Batavia's graveyard. No, Hieronymus was worried that the men would use the boat to reach the rescue ship, which would probably arrive at the high island first. If Hayes told the rescuers what the undermerchant and his merry band of mutineers had done, they could kiss their mutiny and their lives goodbye. Those on Hayes Island needed to be removed from the equation. Wiebe Hayes also knew the ship would reach them first and was well aware that the mutineers were coming to kill them next. The defenders prepared for war. It is possible that Hayes, who was 42, had received training in the Dutch army. Prince Maurits of Orange-Nassau had introduced a whole new training method for his soldiers during the 80 Years' War that was raging at this time. The prince had taught his men about risk assessment and strategic planning. He trained the soldiers to remain calm in the face of danger and to retreat in an orderly fashion while holding on to their weapons. Because this is exactly what Hayes ordered the defenders to do. The soldiers posted a permanent lookout to raise the alarm if the mutineers were coming, so they'd have time to get in position. They started piling rocks into curved walls at various vantage points on the edges of the cliffs. These forts would protect them from the gunfire. They created weapons from stuff that had washed ashore from the wreck. The carpenter defenders made spiked clubs, flattened and filed barrel hoops into swords, and made long pikes with 16-inch nails on the ends. They also made slingshots from their clothes, leaving some half-naked, and collected rocks to use as ammo. How were slingshots and rocks going to work against men with guns? The soldiers didn't intend to hit the mutineers, though that would be a bonus. Muskets were unwieldy but very powerful long-range firearms. The gunpowder was ignited with a burning fuse that the men held in their hand or mouth. The mutineers had to wade through water to get to the beach. If the defenders hit the water with the rocks right next to the mutineers, the splash could make the gunpowder wet or douse the fuses. The muskets would be useless after that. The bad guys had guns, the good guys had rocks. Hieronymus figured that all he needed to do to stop Hayes was to create a rift in the group of defenders. Since sailors and soldiers already hated each other, he only needed to fan the flame and drive a wedge between them. Daniel, my sword was so sharp it went through him like butter, Corneliszoon, was rowed to the high island with a letter addressed to the French soldiers. He was captured immediately, and the defenders found the note. The French translated the letter and read it out loud. Hieronymus told them that they were their truest and most beloved brothers. The French soldiers should come back to Batavia's graveyard and help him restore order. He worried that they believed the evil men who had escaped to their island. Hieronymus had exiled these sailors because they were mutineers. Could they please hand over the escaped sailors and the vicious surgeon who had stolen the yawl the day before? And one more thing, the sailors had a secret compass that they'd use to get to the Southland, leaving them behind. They should tell Wibahayas everything. The undermerchant trusted him to do the right thing. Oh, how they laughed. A secret compass, no less. To go to the Southland? Why would anyone want to go there when they had everything they needed right here? Daniel Cornelis never returned to Batavia's graveyard. Team Hayes had a hostage. There were still 3 cabin boys hiding on Seals Island. They'd been laying low, but had recently been spotted looking for food. The undermerchant ordered his right-hand man, Lance Corporal Jacob Peterson, aka Stonecutter, to row across with 3 minor mutineers who needed blooding and finish the job. The men performed a systematic sweep of the island and flushed the boys out. They captured them, tied them up, put them in the yawl, and rowed them back to Batavia's graveyard. Halfway, they stopped. Stonecutter whispered to one of the boys, Klaas Harmensson, that if he threw the 2 other boys overboard, he would live. Klaas agreed, and after they untied him, he pushed them overboard with the help of VOC assistant Isbrand Isbrandsson. Klaas arrived on Batavia's graveyard, a blooded killer. The 3 top dog mutineers, David Zeevank, Koenraad van Huizen and Gijsbert van Welderen, took the gardener Jan Gerritszoon and sailor Obbe Janszoon to the mast at the wreck site and drowned them there. It was the last drowning. From now on, they'd only use knives and swords. Jan Pelgrom, the general cabin servant, begged the undermerchant for a victim. Hieronymus enjoyed the corruption of the young soul and tried to find Pelgrom a victim twice. The 18-year-old was clearly losing his mind, walking around looking like a man possessed, sleeping with all the women and mocking God, swearing and cursing up a storm. He became the terror of all the people, who feared him more than any of the other principal murderers or evildoers. He had daily on the island run calling out, "Come now, devils, with all the sacraments, where are you? I wish that I now saw a devil. Who wants to be stabbed to death? I can do that very beautifully." Some of the other mutineers were going insane as well, behaving more like beasts than human beings. There was no need to cull the herd anymore. The potential rivals and dissidents were gone. They'd only kill for sport, or when the mutineers got bored. The Reverend Gijsbert Bastiaanszoon had become the mutineers' boatman, launching and reeling in the boats. He spent his days on the beach reading his Bible. Nearly the entire family of the Reverend had been murdered, but he was strictly forbidden to mourn the loss of his wife and 6 children. The mutineers found him weeping very much and ordered him to stop. They said that I ought not to do so, said that it does not matter. Be silent or you go the same way. When Zeevank and the others freely discussed who they were gonna kill next, their attention would often turn to the Reverend. Every day it was, "What shall we do with that one?" The one would decapitate me, the other poison me, which would have been a sweeter death. A third said let him live a little longer. We might make use of him to persuade the folks on the other land to come over to us. The Reverend told his only surviving daughter Judith, who had been forced to become Van Huizen's wife, that she should look for him every morning to see if he had been murdered. Hieronymus was the uncontested emperor of the island, but the gorgeous Lucretia Jansdochter still wouldn't sleep with him. No matter how hard he tried, she turned him down, day after day. In the end, Hieronymus complained to David Zeevank that he could not accomplish his purpose either with kindness or anger. Zeevank answered, "And you don't know how to manage that? I'll soon make her do it." He had then gone into the tent and said to Lucretia, "I hear complaints about you." "On what account?" she asked. "Because you do not comply with Hieronymus's wishes in kindness. Now, however, you will have to make up your mind. Either you will go the same way as Wijbrecht Klaas, or else you must do that for which he has kept the women." That very night, Lucretia finally got into bed with Hieronymus. Her spirit was well and truly broken. The time had come for Team Hayes to be wiped out. Better late than never, I guess. Zeevank and Van Huysen got the men and all the weapons ready for the assault. The musketeers made up the vanguard, followed by the men carrying daggers and swords. The plan was simple. Land, hunt down the unarmed men, and kill them all. Team Hayes saw them coming a mile off and everyone took up positions. The attackers' boats hit the shallows. They had to wade the rest of the way and be careful not to drop the muskets in the water. For now, they stayed on board. Some of the defenders stood in the water ready for them, and rocks came flying through the air, hitting a few mutineers and startling others, some of whom then dropped the muskets in the water. This was no Seals Island. These were organized men. The mutineers retreated fast. The defenders waved them goodbye. Next time, send in the men. In the meantime, the Saardam was underway to the Abrolhos Islands with a skeleton crew, just as Hieronymus had predicted. 2 weeks earlier, Governor-General Koen had sent the upper merchant Pelsard on a mission. The Saardam shall therefore set sail in the name of God, and thou shalt hasten thy journey with all possible diligence in order to arrive most speedily at the place where thou hast lost the ship and abandoned the people. Captain Jacob Jacobszoon of the Saardam, or JJ, was a capable sailor, though not as skillful as the Batavia's Captain Jacobs. They had about 600 miles to go and they were making good time. The Saardam would arrive in about 2 weeks. Hieronymus sent Pelgrim, Jan Hendrikszoon and Andries Lieben to kill Anneken Hardens. Perhaps she was being difficult. Perhaps she refused to sleep with the men any longer and Hieronymus wanted to send a message to the other women. Comply or die. Her husband Hans was with the mutineers now and was of no help to her. Pelgrim was very glad and he went quickly to Anneken's tent where Van Welderen was already waiting. Van Welderen picked up a hair ribbon found on the floor and made a noose. He gave it to Pelgrim to strangle Anneken, but the cabin servant was too much of a lightweight to control the struggling woman. So Van Welderen and Hendricks threw her on the ground and told Pelgrim and Lieben to sit on her legs. Hendricks took the ribbon and strangled the poor woman to death. Pelgrim was denied his kill and begged Hieronymus for another chance. It had been 9 days since the failed attempt on Team Hayes. Hieronymus couldn't understand why men with muskets had been unable to defeat men with rocks. They were gonna try again, and this time the undermerchant went with them. The two yawls hit the shallows, the men got into the water and spread out. Still, the rocks launched by the defenders splashed up the water and made the muskets wet and useless. The men returned to the boats. Hieronymus was shocked at his men's failure to breach the defenses, but he was more shocked by something else he'd noticed. It looked like two of his own were preparing to defect to Team Hayes, Surgeon Frans Janszoon and Upper Cooper Jan Willem Selijns. That would not stand. Hieronymus sent Wouter Loos and Jacobs Helweg to take care of Selijns. Loos went over to him with the intention to execute what he was told. But when he got to him, he was so confused in his mind and in such an upheaval that he could not do it, and warned the cooper what had been ordered him, but that he would plead for him, because he was a great friend of Hieronymus. Loos went back to the undermerchant and pleaded for the man's life. Apparently, Loos was Hieronymus's great friend, because Selijns was spared. The undermerchant told Zeevank to pick a few men to go hunt for seals on the other high island. The assistant headed out with Leonard Michelszoon, Matthias Beer, Lucas Jelleszoon and Helweg. Surgeon Frans was told to join them. To be a proper mutineer, you either killed or were killed. The surgeon hadn't murdered anyone yet, despite having been ordered to on Seals Island. He would not dance exactly to their pipes. When they had gone part of the way, the men attacked the surgeon with ultra-violence. Leonard first stabbed him with a pike through his body. After that, Helweg smote his head with a morning star so that he fell down, and Matthias had cleft it quickly with a sword. The man was already dead, but Jelle stabbed Surgeon Frans in his body with a pike for good measure. The next morning, Hieronymus, still angry, gave Jan Hendricks his own dagger and said, "Go and stab Stoffel Stoffelszoon through the heart, that lazy dog who stands there working as if his back is broken, for he is not worth his keep." Hendricks went over and killed Stoffel with 2 stabs. The spies had been right. For months they had told Governor General Koen that Agung, the Sultan of Mataram, was preparing an attack on the company HQ on Java. Koen had ordered several VOC men of war to destroy their stockpiles of rice and boats at Tegal and Serabon, but it had not stopped them. Now they were here. Agung had learned from his mistakes during the last siege and came prepared, but the Susuhaunan had brought 10,000 soldiers. Those were a lot of mouths to feed and to be kept fed. Koen believed they would try to take Batavia by storm, and sooner rather than later. The Governor-General had not been feeling well. Like so many Dutch in the Indies, he had caught some unknown disease, but he had to make a stand, or else Batavia would be lost forever. Koen used a trick to confiscate and destroy the entire supply of rice meant for Agung's soldiers. He prayed it would be over soon. Oh joy! A few days ahead of schedule, Pelsard arrived on the spot where Captain Jacobs said they had been wrecked. But the Abrolhos Islands were nowhere to be seen. The coordinates were wrong. They now had to find a few patches of coral in the vast Indian Ocean. The Sardam started zigzagging up and down along the latitude in an attempt to locate the wreck. Hieronymus showed up at 17-year-old Rogier Dekker's tent. Dekker had been Hieronymus' personal assistant on the ship and so far had been spared the life of a mutineer. Rogier was frying some fish when Hieronymus appeared. He asked the cabin boy to come to his tent. The undermerchant gave Rogier a cup of wine and handed him his own silver dagger. He pointed at a carpenter walking around with VOC clerk Salomon Deschamps. "Stab Hendrik Janszoon in the heart." Dekker went over and plunged the knife in the man's chest, who dropped dead at Deschamps' feet. The clerk did nothing to stop Rogier, and the cabin boy was now a blooded and fully fledged mutineer. Why Hendrik Jans? Because he was there. 6 days passed without murder, and the mutineers were getting restless. Hieronymus needed a diversion. He wanted to try a proper execution. In the Netherlands, an ordinary criminal was hanged, but someone of high rank had the honor of being beheaded. These honorable executions were carried out by a single horizontal stroke from an executioner's sword, while the convict was kneeling upright. They didn't use a chopping block. Hieronymus wanted some of that. There wasn't really anyone left to kill. In fact, they had killed so many on Batavia's graveyard that the mutineers now had to catch fish and birds themselves. Only a small group of artisans was kept alive to do vital work. One of them, Cornelis Alderson, was a boy kept busy mending fishing nets, but he'd been getting ill a lot lately and wouldn't be missed. Pelgrim begged Hieronymus to pick him to do the deed because he would rather do that than eat or drink. The undermerchant said, "Fine." Zeevank protested. The boy was a lightweight, he couldn't lift a sword, let alone swing it. Matthias Beer asked to do the honors instead, and Hieronymus agreed. Pelgrim didn't want to let go of the sword, but Beer yanked it from his hands. Pelgrim now helped to blindfold Alders, while Hieronymus assured the boy, "Now be happy, sit nicely, 'tis but a joke." Beer took off the boy's head with one blow. Hieronymus started laughing, and Zeevank and Beer found the incident also tremendously amusing. Pelgrim wept, because he had been denied another kill. The execution-style murder proved to be a morale boost for the mutineers, but Hieronymus was once again worried about the loyalty of his men, and so he made them take a third oath, undoing all the previous ones. From now on, Hieronymus would be called Captain General, and Stonecutter became the Lieutenant General. But everyone else was now an equal. Sailors, soldiers, carpenters, they were all company. They were all mutineers. 37 mutineers signed it, including the Reverend, who believed it was the best thing to do to stay alive. Now where was that damned rescue ship? She should have been here 2 weeks ago. Captain JJ on the Sardam used his astrolabe to determine the ship's position. They were at the latitude of 27 degrees 56 minutes south. They drifted north. Damn. For 2 weeks now, they'd been trying to find the wreck. It was clear that Captain Jacobs had miscalculated, those coordinates were wrong. After zigzagging along the latitude, they hit an archipelago. 50 miles of reefs, shoals, shallows, and small islands. It was hella dangerous to navigate. Upper steersman Klaas Gerritszoon took soundings regularly to avoid running aground as JJ carefully steered around the treacherous reefs. Then they spotted breakers far to the east. Hooray! That must be it! Pelsart could even see some high islands. A few hours later, they reached the reef. Nope, not the Abrolhos. The high islands the upper merchant thought he had seen had been reflections of the sun in the water. The crew on the Saardam had to carefully continue the search. Pelsart really couldn't afford to lose this ship as well. It was the end of the rain season, and Batavia's graveyard was running dangerously low on water. The mutineers weren't starving yet, but that was also a matter of time. Hieronymus and Lucretia had no rations, but everyone else was getting thinner and had to suck on rocks to make spit. Van Huysen and Lieben started to complain. A revolt was brewing. Hieronymus feared he would soon be overthrown. He had to get his hands on Team Hyas' supplies. Time to try some diplomacy. The wheeling-dealing Captain General put all his 37 mutineers and the 6 women into the yawls and landed on a small island just off the coast of Hyas Island. Hieronymus had brought cloth and wine to bargain with. Hyas was instantly suspicious when the Reverend came asking for a parley. Everything had just been one big misunderstanding, the Reverend said. All Hieronymus had wanted to do was to protect the people until the rescuers arrived. If Hyas approved, Hieronymus would come over himself and make a deal. The Reverend had to make many trips back and forth before Hyas agreed to negotiate, and a rough deal was made. In exchange for some sorely needed cloth and wine, the defenders would return the boat that Aris Janszoon had stolen. And in exchange for some barrels of fresh water and cat meat, the mutineers would give the defenders woodworking tools. Van Huysen was baffled that Hieronymus was dealing at all. They should fight them. The Captain General assured him it was all part of the plan, saying joyfully to his folk that they now quite certainly had those people surely in his hands. Hieronymus was convinced he could smooth talk the defenders into becoming mutineers. Hieronymus landed on the beach with the goods, and everything was set for a simple exchange. Hyas had allowed Hieronymus to bring 5 men and the Reverend. He figured a small meeting was safest. Naturally, the Captain General brought some of his most lethal killers: Zeevank, Van Huysen, Van Welderen, Pieters and Loos. They were all heavily armed. Lieutenant General Stonecutter stayed behind to watch the women and keep the other mutineers in check. Hieronymus was all smiles as he addressed the men, saying he would harm none, that it had only been on the account of the water that he had fought against them, and that there was no need to distrust him, because some had been killed. Team Hyas was unimpressed. They knew water shortage had only recently become an issue. Zeevank and Van Huysen were walking hither and thither, trying to talk to the defenders. They wanted to turn a few men against Hyas. Zeevank offered 2 Frenchmen 6,000 guilders each, plus a share of the jewels if they switched sides. They should remain with Hyas and then they would murder him together. The Frenchmen were like, nah, we're good. Hyas figured out what was happening and that the deal had been a ruse to get to his men. At his signal, the defenders disarmed and hogtied the mutineers in seconds. Hieronymus began to swear, "Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal." The mutineers on the little island started coming at them, and by grabbing the mutineers, Hyas had lost the advantage. It took 2 men to restrain each of the 6 captured men. In fact, Wouter Loos even managed to tear himself free and escaped. Hyas realized he had no other option and gave the order, "Kill them all, save Hieronymus." Team Hyas didn't need to be told twice and unleashed their fracking fury using the mutineers' own weapons. Moments later, David Zeevank, Koenraad van Huysen, Gijsbert van Welderen and Cornelis Pieters all lay dead on the beach. The tied-up Hieronymus was dragged back to camp. The Reverend pleaded with Hyas to save his daughter, but the other mutineers were closing in. Hyas could do nothing. The Reverend turned his back on Udic, praying God would protect her. The mutineers retreated to Batavia's graveyard. They had tried and failed 3 times to take the island. Now their leader was captured, and 4 principal killers were dead. Vibahaius' men were drunk on victory and the wine they now had. They discussed their options, to kill or not to kill Hieronymus. Eventually, Haius decided that the undermerchant was a valuable asset for future negotiations. He should be kept alive for the time being. But he would work as their servant. Hieronymus was thrown into a limestone pit inland. The defenders tossed the birds they caught down the well. Their prisoner had to pluck them. For every 9 birds, he could keep 1 as pay. The undermerchant was soon covered in bird guts and feathers. The survivors were stunned to see the mutineers return to Batavia's graveyard without the undermerchant and the 4 main killers. The mutineers quickly elected a new leader. You might think they'd pick Lieutenant General Stonecutter, but they chose Wouter Loos, a soldier, instead. He and Hieronymus must have been really close. Lucretia and Udic were glad to hear that their unchosen husbands were gone, but they feared what would happen next. Would Loos take 1 or both of them? Or would they now join the other women in public service? Neither. Loos ordered that both women had to be respected, and everyone obeyed. Loos stayed with Lucretia in the undermerchant's tent, but he never laid a finger on her. The killing was over as well, but the rationing remained, and the rest of the women were still kept in public service. Loos made the mutineers swear an oath of loyalty to him, and he prepared to lead the men to free Hieronymus. Loos was a soldier who knew a thing or two about warfare. Hieronymus had always ignored his suggestions, but he was now in charge. He had a plan, and Haius had a thing coming his way. Pelsard had reached frustration level 3000. The Sardam had finally dropped anchor at the Abrolhos Islands, but they couldn't find their way through 90 miles of shallows and reefs to reach the survivors, and the wind was pushing them in the wrong direction. They decided to risk it. Ever so carefully, frequently taking soundings, and on the lookout for anything that would tear their hull to pieces, they moved in. Then they saw the Southland at precisely 28 degrees. Damn! They'd overshot their target and needed to turn around, but now there was a storm and the reef was right there. They had to go for anchor and wait. 2 days later, the Sardam weighed anchor again and wound her way through the breakers to approach the Abrolhos from the east. 5 days after losing Hieronymus, Loos led 20 mutineers wading through the shallows toward Haius Island. Haius got his 47 fighting men ready. Half of them were soldiers, and the rest were able-bodied sailors who were all better fed and rested than the mutineers. At 9 a.m., it was on. Haius wanted to get the mutineers in close quarters so they could attack them with pikes and swords during the 2 minutes that they needed to reload their guns. If they didn't get close enough, they'd be picked off one by one. This is what Loos wanted. His men's muskets could wound and kill at 100 yards. Rocks could only be thrown at them from 40 yards tops. Loos made sure his men never got closer than 50 yards. Methodically, this time, the mutineers moved forward. All Haius' men could do was launch their rocks from the beach. Every so many steps, the mutineers halted to shoot any defenders standing in the water near the beach. Fire, reload. Move forward, stop. Fire, reload, move forward, stop. Fire. 1 defender was shot, and another, a third, a fourth. 2 hours in, Loos never pressed the attack. He could do this all day if they had to. Haius had to move his men back. One of the 4 defenders hit, Jan Dirks, an 18-year-old soldier from Emden, died from his wound later. The mutineers suffered no losses at all. Loos' strategy was working. The odds were turning in his favor. Once the mutineers gained a footing on land, the defenders would be done for. Haius kept falling back. He despaired. Could they keep falling back while one after the other was shot down? They'd run out of island eventually. Sails ho! That's some next level Deus Ex Machina crap. But it actually happened. Sails appeared on the horizon at this exact moment. It was the Saardam. The night before the attack, Pelsard finally saw the reef of the wrecked Batavia and the high island. The steersmen weren't sure and thought it was some other land, but Pelsard recognized it. But it was getting dark. There were reefs everywhere, and they went for anchor. The next morning, at dawn, the Saardam got underway again. Soon the yacht was only a few miles from the island, and Pelsard had her men lining the decks to look for signs of life. At 10 a.m., they found it. Smoke on a long island west of the wreck, and also on another island close by. Pelsard was relieved. At least some were still alive. Captain Jacob Jacobsson navigated the ship to the nearest island and dropped anchor. They could go no further without stranding the ship. Pelsard took some bread, water, and wine and had 6 sailors row him to the nearest island. This was the first high island, the one next to Highest Island. Sails, sails on the horizon! Yes! Highest had already taken off with 3 men to get to the yawl hidden on the other side of the island. It would be 3 miles to row to the Saardam. The mutineers couldn't believe it. They were dead men, unless they could get to that ship before Team Highest. Helgrom urged Loos to move. Come on! Won't we now seize the yacht? Loos replied, No, I've given up on the idea. The other mutineers thought differently, and led by Stonecutter, raced to their yawl and started rowing for the Saardam. The defenders were rowing, the mutineers were rowing. Both were about equal distance from the VOC yacht, and neither party knew where the other one was. Pelsard and the Saardam sailors made landfall, but where was the welcoming party? Then the upper merchant saw a wonderful sight. A very small yawl with 4 men coming around the northerly point, rowing furiously. Why were they rowing so hard? Pelsard told his crew to get their weapons ready. The makeshift boat landed and a man rushed towards them, calling from afar, Welcome, but go back on board immediately, because there is a band of villains on the island near the wreck, with 2 sloops who have the intention to seize the yacht. Team Highest had won the race. Pelsard looked at the man dressed in shredded clothes and animal fur. Highest quickly relayed the story of mutiny and murder. The upper merchant was reeling. Over 100 people had been killed? Men, women, and children? And they captured the under merchant because of what was happening? Yeah, skedaddle. Pelsard was like, Got it. Bring me the under merchant. Bound. Highest took off again. The 6 Saardam sailors pulled like madmen for the yacht, and not a moment too soon, as Pelsard saw a sloop with people rowing come around the southerly point of the high island. It was the mutineers' boat coming on with steady strokes. The upper merchant barely had enough time to climb on board and alert the Saardam crew. The sloop arrived, 11 heavily armed men, all dressed in the finest cloth. That's company property. At Pelsard's command, all guns in the Saardam were trained on the group, including the board cannon, packed, primed, and ready to fire. The upper merchant greeted them, but cut to the chase. I called out to them, Why are you armed? They answered me that they would tell me once they got on the ship. Yeah, that wasn't gonna happen. Pelsard demanded that they throw their weapons overboard. The mutineers were like, But that's company property, won't they be mad? Pelsard was like, I am the company, sonny. There was a standoff. Of course there was. The men in the boat refused to lay down their weapons, and the Saardam's crew threatened to open fire. Finally, the mutineers realized it was over, and they dropped their weapons in the water. As they climbed on board one by one, each of them was shackled and locked up in the forecastle. That afternoon, Pelsard began interrogating his prisoners one by one, hearing all the gory, gruesome details of what had happened during the past 3 months. Soldier Jan Hendriksson was particularly forthcoming. He told the upper merchant about the mutiny on the Batavia, the attack on Lucretia, and confessed to having killed about 20 people. But the under merchant was the mastermind of it all. And every mutineer Pelsart talked to said the same thing. They had done some bad things, but it was all Hieronymus' fault. That evening, Hayes brought the notorious undermerchant aboard the Saardam, tied up, as Pelsart had asked. Pelsart looked at him with great pain in his heart. Such a rogue, cause of so much doom and of the human blood that was spilled, and still had his mind set on continuing. However, God had not permitted it. Hieronymus was appalled. He was not to blame for anything. Not the mutiny on the ship, not the attack on Lucretia, not the deaths on the island, and not the new mutiny that was planned on the rescue ship. It was all David Zeevank and Koenraad van Huysen who forced him to do it. He'd only agreed to the plans because he had feared for his life. Pelsart didn't believe a word he said. In this matter, with evident lies, he tried to talk himself clean with his glib tongue, making out that nowhere he had had a hand in it. The following morning, Pelsart, JJ, and his crew went to Hayes Island to check out the forts. Pelsart armed 10 of Hayes' soldiers with muskets, and they all rode to Batavia's graveyard where the rest of the scoundrels were, in order to capture and secure them. The remaining mutineers saw the upper merchant coming and knew it was over, and surrendered without a fight. They were bound hand and foot and transported to Seals Island and kept under guard there. In the evening, Pelsart had the 12 prisoners from the Saardam brought to the island as well for security reasons. Jan Karstenszoon, the defender, and Klaas Janszoon, the trumpeter, were reunited with their wives. So, what's up? Awkward. Pelsart walked straight to the undermerchant's tent and collected the jewels that were scattered all over the place. He found everything, except for one ring. Pelsart found the signed oaths. He now had a suspect list. Next, the upper merchant checked the wreck and the money chests. The ship was lying in many pieces, and only a small portion of the bulwark was still above water. Pelsart's heart sank. He feared he would never find the chests. But Batavia's steward, Reindert Hendrikszoon, one of the unwilling mutineers, had seen the money chest while he was fishing on a calm day. They could be brought up, weather permitting. That was a relief. Pelsart was legally bound under Dutch law to mete out justice as soon as possible and without delay. To ensure authority, he brought together a fleet's council with members from the Saardam and the Batavia to start the interrogations. This council had the same powers as a Dutch court on land, so they could quickly deal with mutineers and murderers. But Pelsart had to be able to justify the sentences to the Governor-General later. The following crimes were examined: planning a mutiny on the Batavia, plundering the money chests and the liquor cabinet right after the wrecking, misappropriation of company property, to kill and have killed people, the abuse of married and unmarried women, plotting a mutiny on the first ship that would return, preventing the sermon, and swearing. The most severe crime was abusing company property, then mutiny, then murder, in that order. The court's recorder was none other than Salomon Deschamps, despite being a mutineer. Conspiracy theorists want to see more into this, but the notary was probably the only one skilled enough to take notes. There were no lawyers and no witnesses for the defense. Still, no one could be executed unless they freely and fully confessed their crime. Torture was allowed to get the process started. Hieronymus was brought out and accused of being the root of all evil that transpired on the island. The undermerchant was stunned. He was not to blame for any of it. How could Pelsart believe that? David Zeevank and Koenraad van Huysen had forced him. These men came to his tent, held him at knife point, and told him that the island could only support 40 people. They wanted to kill everyone at once, but he persuaded them not to. He saved people. Pelsart was sure he was lying. He tries to exonerate himself with flowery talk, shoving dirt onto persons who are dead and cannot answer for themselves. Torture it was. The only torture available to them on the island was medieval water torture. A canvas collar was tied around the neck like a bucket, and water was poured in. The only way not to drown was to drink until you couldn't drink anymore. It took days of torture to get Hieronymus to confess, because every time after being legally allowed to recover his senses, he recanted his confessions. Witnesses were brought in to testify against him. He would confess, then recant, and on and on. Hieronymus kept denying that he'd been planning a mutiny and that he was a victim of the evil plots of Zeevank. And Gaius was a dirty rat. He stole the company's stuff after they had struck an honest deal. More torture. We can do this all night, y'all. Hieronymus did give detailed accounts of the crimes the other mutineers committed, though, throwing them all under the bus. One by one, the mutineers were brought in, and most of them confessed right away. Some, like Matthias Beer and Rutger Frederiks, held out for a bit, but torture got them to admit their crimes in the end. Andries Jonas was tortured twice because he kept insisting that he stayed outside the reverend's tent while the family was being murdered. Because Jonas freely confessed to other crimes, Pelsart decided to believe him on that count. Only Hans Hardens, whose daughter and wife were killed, was not held responsible for his murders. A complete picture started to emerge as the mutineers, but also survivor testimonies poured in. All the people said the same thing. Hieronymus was the puppet master. He'd been planning a mutiny on the Batavia, he was the leader who ordered the deaths of over 100 people, and he was the culprit of the plot against the Saardam. In the meantime, with the weather being so calm, divers started trying to recover the treasure at the wreck site. Among other valuable things, 10 money chests were quickly recovered. The 11th was trapped under a cannon and an anchor and couldn't be retrieved. The 12th had been busted by Jean Thiriou, who had made it rain coins on the Batavia wreck. After 10 days of examinations, Hieronymus and 7 main mutineers were found guilty by the fleet's council. Lennart Michielszoon, Matthias Beer, Jan Hendrikszoon, Albert Janszoon, Rutger Frederikszoon, Jan Pelgrom and Andries Jonas. The council was ready to wrap it up when Hieronymus recanted all. Again. Enough! The collar was back on. And again Hieronymus confessed to everything, but he kept using different ways to delay the sentencing. It drove Pelsart absolutely mad. Torture, witnesses, the whole nine was brought out again. The undermerchant confessed at last that he did it to lengthen his life. Hieronymus signed his confessions late in the afternoon. He well knows that all he had done is evil enough, and he desires no grace. The men deserve to die, but when and where? Could they risk taking them back to Batavia and have Koen do it? Or should they get it over with here and prevent a possible mutiny aboard the Saardam, because these guys seemed capable of anything by now? Pelsart wrote, "It would not be without dangers for the ship and the goods to set off to sea with so many corrupt and half-corrupted men. The latter could easily become wholly corrupted by the richness of the salvaged wealth." At sunset, Pelsart gathered everyone to hear the sentencing. The prisoners were lined up. They were the walking dead. The council had decided unanimously that Hieronymus Corneliszoon of Haarlem, together with the worst and most willing mutineers, would receive the following sentences. Hieronymus Cornelis, apothecary and later undermerchant of the ship Batavia, shall be taken to Seals Island, and there firstly to cut off both his hands, and after this shall be punished on the gallows with the cord until death shall follow. He also lost all his money and property to the General East India Company. It was the maximum penalty available under Dutch law. The sentences for the others were pretty much the same. Jan Hendriks, Lennart Michiels, Albert Jans and Matthias Beer were all sentenced to have their right hand removed before they were hanged, while Jan Pelgrom, Andries Jonas and Rutger Frederiks would simply be hanged. One group of criminals, Stonecutter among them, would be taken to Batavia for further investigation, and another group would be sentenced later. Others still were let go for the time being, though some of them were closer to Hieronymus than Pelsart knew, and they were still dangerous. There were also rewards. Wiebe Hayes was made a sergeant for having protected the people with bravery and got a pay raise. All defenders were rewarded with higher ranks and increased wages. Before I continue, I need to point out that some people believe Hieronymus' denials and say that Pelsart made a lot up to save his own reputation. They claim that the apothecary was indeed the victim of Zeevank and Van Huysen and that he was not a heretic, that Pelsart invented the first mutiny and put pressure on the council to back him up. There is no evidence for this. There is little logic behind the theory. And these people often ignore many pieces of testimony and information, disregard the morals and values of this age, and used 21st century psychology to explain 17th century behavior that was not seen on any other wrecked VOC ship. For instance, Pelsart didn't question or sentence the number 2 mutineer and brought him back to Batavia for exclusive interrogation by Koen. Stonecutter could have undermined everything Pelsart claimed in his journal, and it is clear he didn't. Pelsart certainly embellished his role and tried to make himself look good, but him creating such an elaborate scheme with all the fine, sometimes inconsistent details, like every normal eyewitness account ever, was way above this merchant's pay grade, even if he had Salomon to help him. Euronymous was miffed. He had done nothing wrong. He wrote 2 letters to people back home, claiming his innocence. He wanted to smuggle these letters out, but the man he'd roped in to do it handed them to Pelsart. Then Euronymous wanted the Reverend to baptize him and have time to bewail his sins in peace and repentance. It was another delaying tactic. Pelsart could not refuse it, so fine, baptism in 2 days. Euronymous begged Pelsart to tell him when he was going to die. Pelsart let him sweat for a while, but then he had someone tell him, the day after tomorrow, October 1st. Whereupon he said, "Tut, nothing more? How can one show repentance of life in so few days? I thought I should be allowed 8 or 14 days. So that he began to rage, saying, "I see well, they want my blood and my life, but God will not suffer that I shall die a shameful death. I know for certain, and you will all see it, that God will perform unto me this night a miracle, so that I shall not be hanged." Pelsart knew what that meant. He ordered everyone to stay away from the under-merchant and not give him anything that he could use to kill himself. But Euronymous literally had a trick up his sleeve, Mercurium sublimatum, the same poison he used to try to kill the baby. He quickly downed the liquid. According to Pelsart, it started to work at about 1 o'clock in the morning, so that he was in full pain and seemed like to die. In this great anxiety, he asked for some Venetian theriac. At last he began to get some relief, but he had to be got out of his prison certainly 20 times during the night because his so-called miracle was working from below as well as from above. On Sunday, the Reverend held a service for the mutineers on Seals Island. He called for Euronymous to be baptized, but he refused. Pelsart was baffled. The man was about to die, and he sought no solace in religion. On October 1st, the wind was blowing too hard to get out to Seals Island. The day of reckoning was scheduled for the next day. Lucrezia fought her way forward to confront Euronymous. She bitterly lamented to the said Jerome over the sins he had committed with her against her will and forcing her hereto. To which Jerome replied, "It is true, you are not to blame, for you were in my tent 12 days before I could succeed." He was first to be led to the gallows so the other mutineers could see that the seducer of men had died. They feared that if he was last to go, he might still talk his way out of it. But Euronymous could not reconcile himself to dying or to penitence, neither to pray to God, nor to show any face of repentance over his sins. But they all shouted at each other, revenge at Euronymous, and Euronymous shouted revenge back at them. At last he challenged them, as well as the council before God's judgment seat, that he wanted to seek justice there with them, because he had not been able to get it here on earth. His hands were cut off with a chisel and a hammer, and he was quickly led to the gallows so he wouldn't bleed to death before he hanged. The other mutineers followed in quick succession. Just as Matthias Beer was about to be hanged, he quickly confessed to the Reverend. He killed 4 other men and a boy whose throat he slit right in front of Euronymous one night, but he didn't know the name. Henri Jonas confessed killing a sick boy who came into his tent scared of the recent killings, pleading for safe shelter. Stonecutter had told him to drag the boy out and cut his throat. He didn't know the boy's name. Allard Jans warned Pelsart to watch his back on his way to Java. Other mutineers were walking free. No names. He ain't no snitch. Then it was Leonard Michals, Rutger Frederiks, and Jan Hendrik's turn to die. Only one man left, Jan Pelgrom. According to Pelsart, the 18-year-old could not compose himself to die, weeping and wailing and begging for grace, and that one should put him on an island and let him live a little longer. Therefore, on account of his youth, one has begged for his life, which at last we have granted to him, and put him on an island or on the mainland according to the occasion occurring. Meanwhile, at Company HQ on Java, wave after wave of the Sultan of Mataram's native soldiers charged at Batavia. Dutch soldiers, armed Chinese merchants, and Japanese samurai held their ground, firing muskets and cannons into the oncoming troops. 6 weeks later, the day that the traitors were hanged, Agung gave up on the siege, humiliated and dishonored. They had no more food, and the Javanese retreated at night. In the now deserted encampment, neatly laid out in rows, were the bodies of 800 freshly slaughtered Javanese soldiers and officers. They had failed to do what the Sultan had ordered them to do: win. The Matarams never attacked again, and trade soon picked up, stronger than ever. On the Abrolhos Islands, Pelsart's obsession with retrieving company goods became ridiculous. He kept the survivors waiting for weeks and weeks to return to civilization, sending out search parties to get each little thing from all the islands, rocks, and reefs. Pelsart sent the Saardam's captain out in a boat to recover a single flask of vinegar he'd seen on the rocks. JJ took 4 men and Cornelis the fat trumpeter and rowed to retrieve it. They were never seen again. The next day, Pelsart realized that the Saardam had probably lost her captain. 2 weeks later, the people spotted several columns of smoke on the Southland coast. Pelsart believed it was Captain JJ. They would swing by to check it out on their way back to Java. The weather made it impossible to retrieve the final chest. After digging up a few real, the divers were like, "We're done." Pelsart forced them to continue the search for a few more days, but then finally, he gave up. This was all he could retrieve. He hoped it would be enough. The upper merchant decided to sentence the remaining mutineers who had all been spared a death sentence. Lucas Jelleszoon, Rogier Dekker, Abram Gerritszoon, Klaas Harmenszoon, Salomon Deschamps were all killers, but there were extenuating circumstances. Some were sentenced to be dropped from the yardarm, others keelhauled. All received 100 lashes before the mast. One of the big-shot mutineers was Wouter Loos. He was charged with being the mutineer captain and for attacking Hayes, but not for any killings. Being a mutiny leader warranted a death sentence, but Pelsart seemed to have considered the good things he'd done. He had saved Jan Willem Selijn's life, refused to launch an attack on the Saardam, protected Lucretia and Judik, and had not ordered any more killings on Batavia's graveyard. He was sentenced to be marooned. But in those days, being marooned was just a really slow death. Another 19 mutineers were reserved to be interrogated by Koen men back at Java, including Stonecutter, the second in command. 2 months after the Saardam had arrived, Pelsart, the Batavia survivors, and the mutineers sailed away. Klaas Gerrits, Batavia's upper steersman, was the captain now. Of the 341 people aboard the Batavia, only 77 boarded the Saardam. 6 survivors were women, and there was 1 child. Less than 6 of the Batavia's crew had not joined the mutineers. Sadly, we don't know their names. But since Hieronymus considered them to be more valuable alive than dead, they were probably carpenters, cooks, and coopers. The 7 mutineers still swung from the gallows on Seals Island when the Saardam sailed away. Pelsart was sailing along the Southland coast looking for Captain JJ when he saw smoke and decided to check it out. He didn't find a trace of the crew, but the place was inhabited. They found naked footprints, though the blacks kept themselves hidden and did not show themselves to anyone, and there was fresh water in a gully. It was the perfect place for Jan Pelgrom and Wouter Loos to be marooned. They became the first 2 white settlers on the Australian continent. Usually, maroon people were given some water and a loaded gun. Once the water ran out, they were expected to shoot themselves. But the 2 mutineers were given a fighting chance. Apart from water and basic food, they were given knives, beads, bells, and small mirrors. They could try to win the natives for them. They might even meet their chiefs, learn their ways, live among them, and perhaps even prosper. Pelsart's instruction to them was to first have courage. Man's luck is found in strange places. If God guides you, you will not suffer damage from the natives. On the contrary, because they have never seen a white man, they will offer you friendship. So far, so good, but this was the company. You must look out for whatever gold and silver there is among the natives and observe closely what it is that the natives deem valuable. If God was kind to them, they might even be picked up by a VOC vessel and be able to tell the company all that they learned about the land. I see sequel potential right there. Pelsart noted their exact location: 27 degrees, 51 minutes south. All VOC skippers would be given these coordinates so they could keep an eye out for the marooned mutineers. He didn't know that the white man's track record of surviving the Aboriginals was not good. But this tribe, the Nanda, might have treated them well. No one ever saw them again, and we don't know what happened. Over time, vague traces of white people were discovered in this area. However, these could also have come from survivors of other wrecked ships. Plenty of ships were wrecked or lost on the Australian shores at a later date. Many survivors were angry that not all the mutineers were marooned, and 9 mutineers begged Pelsart to be sentenced before they got to Java. No one wanted to be judged by the terror of the Indies' Governor-General Coen. Pelsart knew that Coen would want to try the mutineers himself, yet the council decided not to trouble further the Honorable Lord Governor-General in his many duties, as we feared that the Javanese War is causing him enough heartburning, although we hope it is not so. They compromised. 8 mutineers were brought on deck to be sentenced. Stonecutter, the only major mutineer left, would have to face Coen. All the way back, Pelsart was a nervous wreck. He lived in constant fear that the ship would hit another reef, and he dreaded facing Governor-General Coen. He was often ill and pretty much confined to his cabin, where he mostly worked on inventory and his reports with Salomon Deschamps. The Sardam arrived at last in Batavia in a third of the time it had taken the longboat. It was the middle of monsoon season and the humidity was unbearable. Everyone hurried to get to shore. Pelsart did not. He needed a moment. However, during the siege, Governor-General Coen had collapsed while promenading on his balcony. He saw Jacques Spex, part of the Fall Fleet, arriving and reportedly said, "There is Spex, my successor." Perhaps he feared to face him because Coen had recently flogged Spex's daughter, Sarah, in public for having had sex with a boy in his apartment where she lived. It was probably heart failure. Either way, he died at age 42. Indeed, Spex became the Dutch United East India Company's next Governor-General for the East a few days later. Pelsart was like, phew. The man who replaced Coen would probably be less severe. Probably. This was the company, after all. The company was the company, and Spex turned out to be nearly as severe as Coen. The Governor-General decided to review the sentences of the 14 mutineers and send them to the dungeons to be interrogated by the public prosecutor, Anthony van den Heuvel. Among the 14 were those who had already been punished, like Salomon Deschamps. And there was also Stonecutter, who had not been hurt at all. After the investigation, Spex felt that Pelsart had been far too lenient and resentenced the lot. 5 more mutineers were hanged: Jacob van Helweg, Lucas Jellis, Salomon Deschamps, and Daniel Like Butter Cornelis, who also had his right hand cut off. The 5th mutineer hanged was either one of 2 guys, as an act of mercy. Rogier Dekker and Abraham Gerrits from Sierra Leone, the 2 youngest mutineers, had to draw lots. One would be hanged, the other severely flogged with a halter around the neck. We don't know the outcome of the draw. Andries Liebend, Hans Frederik and Olivier van Welderen were tied to a pole and flogged severely. They were put in chains and exiled from Batavia. It's unlikely they survived long out in the Javanese jungle. Cornelis Boontje Jans was flogged and branded a looter and a mutineer. Klaas Harmens was whipped. VOC officer Isbrand Isbrands continually insisted that he had acted under duress and was given leniency. His sentence was to stand with a halter around his neck to watch the executions. The worst sentence was reserved for Stonecutter. He had assisted with the massacre at Seals Island, helped organize the murder of the Reverend's family, and had advised Hieronymus on who should be killed next. But, worst of all, he'd been involved in plotting the mutiny on the Saardam. Stonecutter was to be broken from under upwards and the body put on the wheel. It was the most barbaric and painful method of execution in the Dutch Republic, a type of crucifixion. Tied to a bench, the executioner smashed his bones to pieces, starting with the toes and fingers and working his way inward, making sure Stonecutter never lost consciousness. His body, now extremely flexible, was twisted around the wagon wheel. His ribs might also have been broken to make breathing excruciatingly painful. The wheel would be hoisted up so all could see him breathe his last. Death was generally because of internal bleeding, but it could take hours, sometimes days. After his death, the executioner cut Stonecutter open. His entrails were displayed in the Batavia citadel for weeks. The council also thought that Pelsard had been too stingy with the rewards. After review, the company increased Wiebe Hayes' salary to 40 guilders a month. They made him an officer and a standard-bearer of the VOC army, and he returned to Amsterdam in triumph. It appeared he died soon after. All his Defender soldiers were promoted to cadets. Defender sailors got a salary bump, and everyone was given a 2-month wage bonus for having shown themselves to be faithful and having piously resisted evil. The Saardam's crew was given 100 pieces of 8 to share among themselves. A lot of goods have been recovered. The list had 32 items: money chests, cannons, packs of linen, silverwork, barrels of cochineal, and Pelsard's jewels. But a flask of vinegar, an object for which JJ and his crew had lost their lives trying to retrieve, was valued so low it wasn't even assessed. The Batavia's captain Adriaan Jacobs' case was put before the Council of the Indies over a year later. Pelsard had returned with fresh evidence and accusations, but they were from dead mutineers. This was now hearsay and not admissible as testimony. The captain denied having been part of a mutiny, and he never confessed freely, but Spex was pretty sure Jacobs was part of it. The skipper was very much suspected that this had happened with his knowledge, yea, even with his aid and at his instigation. About this, he and a certain other female who had been the servant of Lucretia have been examined by the fiscal and brought before the Council of Justice, but through the obscurity of the case, no verdict has yet been given. Zwaantje probably died in the fort. She was definitely in custody and interrogated by December, but by January, Jacobs was the ship's only prisoner left in the dungeon. Spex absolutely believed Jacobs was guilty, but so was Pelsard. A completely godless and evil life has been conducted on the Batavia, of which both the skipper and Pelsard are greatly guilty. May the Almighty God forgive their sins. The company actually believed that the women were the cause of all this. Their very presence had made the men lose all sense of reason and decency, because, I don't know, women are evil? The VOC decided to ban women from the ships from now on, only allowing the wives of high-ranking officers aboard. There are no records of what happened to Jacobs. The 17 of the company board actually cleared him of all wrongdoing. They felt that he had been unfairly persecuted based on very little evidence. If no other information emerged, he should be released and could be sent to the Netherlands as a passenger. We don't know if he found that out and was set free. We do know he wasn't executed. It is likely, considering his living conditions, that he died in the dungeon awaiting the 17's verdict. Jan Willem Selijns, who took part in the Seals Island massacre, must have convinced Pelsard of his innocence. There is no mention of him having been tried or that he died. Rykert Wouters' disappearance from Batavia's graveyard was never solved. 4 men in the longboat who were involved in the Batavia mutiny vanished before news arrived of their participation in the plot. Pelsard returned to his womanizing ways and was caught sleeping with a woman whose husband was away on business. He was reprimanded and ended the affair by January when he was summoned before the Council of the Indies to present his case. He was not praised, he was not punished. He had lost the ship, abandoned the people, but he had recovered a lot of the company's property. We'll call it even. He wasn't appointed to the East Indies Council either, because that recommendation hadn't arrived yet. He did end up on another council for certain legal cases. He was the second in command of a military mission to Sumatra to raise the Portuguese siege of Jambi, a pepper port. After 2 months, the siege was lifted. Pelsart went back to Surat, India in September, but his mission was a failure. The new Grand Mogul was not interested in the jewelry, a blunder that cost the VOC a lot of money. Pelsart died that month, probably from the illness he had caught in India. He was 35. After he died, his reputation took a severe hit. The company discovered valuables in his possession, which seemed intended for private trade. There was no proof, but the VOC confiscated the lot anyway, leaving the upper merchant's family with nothing. Once the 17 read Pelsart's journal, they were less than impressed with his conduct. They condemned his weak sentencing of the mutineers, his blunder on the deal in India, and the suspicion of private trade. Pelsart's career would have been over, hadn't he already been dead. Before Lucretia had even left the Netherlands, her husband Boudewijn van der Meylen had been posted to a pestilent trading post in Burma called Arakan. He died shortly after from an unknown illness. But the survivors accused her of conspiring with Hieronymus. They claimed she had given him the names of some people to kill. She had been kept separated from the others and had not been in contact with the women in public service. Still, she was charged with instigating and supporting the evil acts and murders. She refused to confess, so the fiscaal agreed to a scherper examen, in other words, torture. The Governor-General and the Council of the Indies decided to give Lucretia one last chance and told her that it would be best if she revealed the truth of the matter so that she would be spared torture and pain, because the case was so notorious and the witness testimonies many. Lucretia insisted she was innocent. No reports of her interrogation survived. Apparently, she withstood the torture and did not confess. If she had, she would have been sentenced to death as an accomplice to the murders. Instead, Lucretia remarried a year later to Sergeant Jacob Corneliszoon Cuyck from Leiden and returned to the Netherlands in 1635. She never had children, but was a godmother to 6. It appears she died on the 6th of September 1681, which would have made her 71. The Reverend Gijsbert Bastiaan's son was interrogated as well. He was accused of failing on the job. Specs wanted to know why he signed the oath. Had he really done everything possible to oppose the godless? The Council of Justice found him guilty. The Reverend asked for a revision, and the Church Council of Batavia demanded that the verdict be annulled. He was cleared of all wrongdoing 4 months later. However, the Governor-General was never convinced. If a better man had been assigned to the Batavia, things might not have gone the way they did. The Reverend wanted to return to the Netherlands as soon as possible. The council allowed him to leave with the fleet at the end of the next year. He would not receive a salary, and he had to leave his only surviving daughter Judith behind. He didn't want that. After 2 years of mourning, he married a widow, Maria Knijf. He had another son, and he was sent to the remote Banda Islands to minister the troops guarding the world supply of nutmeg. He died of dysentery in 1633. His only surviving daughter Judith married Pieter van der Hoeven within months of arriving. No one cared in the Indies that she was no longer a virgin and penniless. She was a pretty white woman, and that was enough. Her husband died 3 months later. She married again a year later to a minister from Utrecht, Helmich Helmichzoon, who was posted to Ambon. He died in 1634. The VOC was moved by her misfortune. She received 300 guilders a year to compensate for her widowhood and 300 guilders for her general suffering after the wreck. She was able to return to her hometown of Dordrecht. Her journey home wasn't all that though. She traveled with her stepmom and her little stepbrother, who were and were not allowed to dine in the great cabin. None other than the ship's chief trumpeter and defender Jan Karstens insisted that they and the child should not be allowed in. Carstens was not quite right in the head after the Batavia wreck. He hit the boy and chased after his mother, who fled into the cabin. Carstens was sentenced to be dropped from the yardarm and 100 lashes before the mast. The two women safely arrived in the Netherlands in October 1635. We don't know what happened to Hieronymus' wife Beleitgen. After her husband left, she was relegated to an alleyway. It's unlikely she was able to stay in Haarlem once news broke about her husband's crimes. Johannes van der Beek, aka Torrentius, was a lucky duck. He had powerful friends, including stadholder Frederik Hendrik, the Prince of Orange himself, who tried to get the painter released soon after he was sentenced. Another admirer, King Charles I of England, wrote Holland to send him over. King Charles promised that the painter would not be allowed to exercise his godless tongue, but only his art. Very much against the wishes of the mayors of Haarlem, Prince Frederik Hendrik pardoned him. 4 days later, the first ships arrived from the Indies with the horror stories of the Batavia and Torrentius' influence on the course of events. Would he still have been pardoned had Frederik Hendrik known? Unlikely. Torrentius lived in Windsor Castle as a court painter of the English throne for 12 years. He returned to Amsterdam and died aged 55. His only surviving painting, since everything was burnt after sentencing, currently hangs in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. A most unlikely survivor was Batavia's graveyard. The nutrients from the bodies left buried on the island allowed for plants to grow. The barren Batavia's graveyard bloomed for the first time ever. The Dutch had burned all the clove trees on Ternate Island and created a monopoly, which ended in 1770 when a Frenchman secured some seedlings from a clove tree and replanted them in Africa. The VOC ruled for nearly 200 years and became more and more corrupt until it collapsed in 1800. By then it was known as the VOC, Vergaan onder Corruptie, perished by corruption. The Dutch Batavia Republic took on the company debts and annexed all its former territories. The Dutch Indies remained Dutch until 1942, when the invading Japanese crushed it and the Indonesians fought for their independence. Batavia today is Jakarta, and some of the surviving company buildings are now museums and an art gallery. No one forgot about that 11th chest. In 1644, Abel Tasman was given the assignment to go find it, but he ignored those parts of his orders. The Batavia wreck lay undisturbed for centuries. In 1840, the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands were finally chartered by the Royal Navy on the HMS Beagle. They divided the islands into 3 groups. They found part of an ancient wrecked ship on a large island in the southern group. They thought it was the Batavia and named the islands the Pelsaert Group. On Easter Sunday, they mapped the Easter Group. And the third group at the top was the Wallaby Group because of the many wallabies living there. After Janszoon's ongelukkige voyagie van het schip Batavia was translated into English, people tried to figure out which islands were actually involved. The Pelsaert Group didn't match the descriptions, and the wreck was another VOC ship, the Zeewijk. It wasn't until the 1960s that people started searching properly. Leading the charge was Henrietta Drake Brockman, a Perth journalist. She figured the wreck was in the Wallaby Group. The survivors had described seeing, catching, and eating wallabies, so they would have crashed where the wallabies actually lived. Duh. Of the 3 reefs, morning, noon, and evening, she believed the wreck site was at the Noon Reef. In 1960, a cray fisherman, Pop Martin, found a human skull on Beacon Island. He tried to cover it up, but the police got involved and the find got a mention in a newspaper. Beacon Island was Batavia's graveyard, but no one knew this yet. Enter Geraldton builder and diving enthusiast Max Kramer, who decided to search the reef with reporter Hugh Edwards to find the Batavia. When a local cray fisherman found out they were looking for a wreck, he showed them where he had found one, cannons and all. On June 4th, 1963, 334 years to the day that the ship had run aground, Max Kramer became the first man to dive the Batavia. She lay not on the Noon Reef, but on the southeastern end of the Morning Reef in 20 feet of water. The Western Australian Museum and the Royal Australian Navy dove for the wreck many times and recovered 15 cannons, coins, anchors, and navigation instruments, and 137 sandstone blocks, the would-be Batavia Citadel's portico. In the late 90s, a grave of 6 bodies was discovered on Beacon Island. 3 adults, a teenage boy, a small child, and a baby, aged 8 to 9 months. It was believed their throats had been slashed or that they had been strangled. Then, on West Wallaby Island, they discovered 2 rectangular huts, Team Hayes' forts. They still stand today, evidence of the first European habitation in Australia. Part of the Batavia's hull has been recovered. It is now on display together with her finds in the Western Australian Museum Maritime in Fremantle. You can fly out to the islands as well. If you want to walk around on the ship and get a feel for what it was like back in the day, you need to check out the reproduction of the Batavia. She is moored at the Bataviawerf in Lelystad, the Netherlands, not far from Amsterdam. Dutch shipbuilder Willem Vos took over 10 years to build his version of the Batavia, which was launched in 1995. This Batavia even sailed to Australia and back for the Sydney 2000 Olympics. A link to a video of this journey is in the description below. Sadly, the tops of her mast broke off in a storm a few years ago and have been replaced 3 times already. But now the ship is in too shallow water and would topple over if all the masts were completely installed. She's basically stranded. She also needs to come on land ASAP because the hull needs to be repaired. This costs a lot of money. Please consider donating a little money for this worthy cause. The preservation of the Batavia replica, an impressive ship with a unique story. Again, link below.